Y the Last Man, Runaways, Saga. Brian K. Vaughan is one of the biggest names in comics. So why don't that many people talk about Ex Machina? Woof woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Written by Brian K. Vaughan and illustrated by Tony Harris, Ex Machina was originally published by Wildstorm Comics, which is now a part of DC. The first issue was released in August of 2004, with the 50th and final being released 6 years later in August of 2010. Vaughan was already a big name in the comic book industry, with this being the fourth title that he was writing at the time, alongside Ultimate X-Men, The Runaways, and the critically acclaimed Y the Last Man. Harris was still fresh in fans' mind after a legendary run on Starman and a brief stint over at Iron Man. Vaughan created the title out of his own frustrations that he felt after witnessing 9/11 whilst living in New York. He wanted to explore if the concept of heroism was a real thing or just something that we imposed on other people. In 2005, the series won the Eisner Award for the Best New Series, and the rights for the adaptation have been picked up twice already. Once in 2005 by New Line Cinema, and again in January of 2020 where it was picked up by Oscar Isaac. But the title to that planned upcoming movie will be changed to The Great Machine just due to the fact that there's already an incredible movie called Ex Machina, which also stars Oscar Isaac, and I guess maybe he just doesn't want to be typecast in any and all future movies that may possibly be called Ex Machina. But it's been over 15 years since this book first debuted, and incorporating real world politics can either make a story a relic of its time that needs to be carried forward and remembered for the future, or you can make it feel dated pretty much as soon as it's released. With Ex Machina, let's see which one it is. This is my TLDW, which stands for Too Long Didn't Watch, and it's a part of the video for people who maybe don't have time to watch the full thing, but you still want to know if this book's for you. If you're wanting a political drama or a grounded superhero story, then you'll find parts of both in Ex Machina, but there's no real commitment to either. I can't say that it's as well structured as Y the Last Man or as inventive as Saga, but for a unique concept that maybe doesn't stick the landing, there's still something interesting here. And if that's all the review that you needed, thank you for tuning in. Make sure that you check out our sponsor, Organic Price Books. There's an affiliate link in the description, and if you use code WOOFWOOF, you'll get $2 off your order. As well, if you're leaving the video now, make sure that you click that subscribe button and the bell notification so that you never miss a video, and maybe check out one of my previous reviews. Mitchell Undred is elected as the mayor of New York City, a shock considering that he was the underdog, running independent, and spent the previous years as a superhero known as the Great Machine rather than a politician. Alternating between his past and present, we build an image of Mitchell's life and how some of the tough former choices as a hero affect his policies as an elected official. But despite his best efforts, his past always comes back to haunt him, whether it be from previous scandals, supervillains, or even stalkers. But what can he expect considering that he's the man that saved the second tower on 9/11? But despite his best efforts, Mitchell quickly realises that life on the other side of the law might have been easier. But what will he do when the pressures of being the mayor of New York City become too much? How will he be able to gain any respect when the majority of the city just seem as a gimmick and that guy who can talk to machines? And when he realises that he can't run away from the fallout of his vigilante career, will Mitchell be able to leave the Great Machine behind forever? I knew of Tony Harris from Starman, and this doesn't look anything like that. They're both really enjoyable styles, it's just crazy how different they were from each other. If I didn't know anything about Tony Harris and you showed me a page of Starman and a page of Ex Machina, I would not think that they were the same artist. I preferred this one though, as it was a cross between a realistic style, but I felt like there was a pop art influence. There was some tones there that reminded me a bit of Andy Warhol, and I'm not sure if I'm the only person who picked up on that. I just loved that all of his characters looked unique, and I've heard that he does base his designs off people that he knows in his real life, but just appreciated that there was no shameless duplication, even in scenes where there were crowds and it would have been easy to do so. And the way that he illustrated New York City was phenomenal, and it was something in a similar vein that I'd expect if I was reading something where the art was done by Sean Phillips. I do think that Harris was stronger at the start of the book though, and some of that polish was lacking by the end. Obviously that could have something to do with maybe the inkers, the colorists, I'm not too sure on that one, but it was something that I noticed because of the fact that I wasn't reading this monthly. Occasionally there were a few additional artists for special issues, but there wasn't really anything long enough to really make an impression. However, although I was overall impressed with Harris, and I think it showed a great development in his skill from doing Starman, I did have some issues with the way that he drew moving figures. And as well, and I hope I can find it when I'm editing this, but the proportions were occasionally just off. Someone had an arm that was further away from the reader that was longer than the one which was closer. Facial expressions were also a bit hit and miss, with sometimes it just looking like he wasn't sure what to do when he was drawing a mouth when they were supposed to be speaking, but where he really excelled was the flashback scenes with the Great Machine. I loved his design work here, and I loved that there were some sketches in the back of these hardcovers that showed sort of the process for getting that final design, especially when there were other types of superheroes that I won't really get into here without spoiling, but it just showed that he did have a very vivid imagination. It's so hard nowadays to create a superhero design that stands out and looks original, which was one of my complaints whilst reading Jupiter's Legacy. It actually made the sheer number of flashbacks more tolerable because I just love seeing the way that Harris drew it. This was also where he really got to draw some great action, and I think action is where he really excelled, and I just wish there would have been more instances where he would have got a chance to kind of let his hands go and just draw this in the way that he wanted to. Seeing the Great Machine flying or seeing somebody in a car chase, those were the bits that really stand out in my mind, rather than just like the 1800 bit of somebody sitting around a table talking. Obviously it's political drama, so there are going to be an abundance of those scenes, but for me it just showed Harris's true potential when there were scenes with action. I think for a realistic political drama though, this style is great, and I wonder if people may have been a bit thrown back when originally seeing this type of work from Harris. It does help you to become immersed in the story and the world they're creating, whilst also capturing that life that you always hear talked about when people have visited or lived in New York City. Oh boy, strap in folks, because I've got a lot to say about this book, and with a series that's longer than about 25 issues, it's hard to touch on every thought that I had whilst I was reading it. But what I mention here are the main points that stuck with me, and the phrase 1 foot in the door, 1 foot out kept coming back to me as I was reading Ex Machina. I can't lie, I went in with high expectations because Why the Last Man is one of my favourite series, and I found myself to be left wanting more from this book. Obviously I know that he's writing both of them at the same time, but it doesn't feel like the same Brian K Vaughan who has that full control over the story that he's telling. The storylines that are played up to be a big part that have absolutely no weight, characters that are near irrelevant to the story become main players abruptly and in a way that felt contrived, ironically in a kind of Deus Ex Machina type of way. Maybe Brian K Vaughan was doing that intentionally with the title that he's got here, but from being honest, reading this made me concerned for the rest of Saga, just in case that's going to go in a similar direction and not really have any point to it by the end. It's disappointing to have to say that the initial hook doesn't actually play into the overall story, and they'll be vague to try and avoid spoilers, but it's more just an anecdote, which to me made me feel like it was only added in for some kind of initial shock factor and to grab attention. Imagine if in Why the Last Man all the males died at the end of issue 1, but then it's just an afterthought for the other 59 issues that the other characters just occasionally mention and then get on with normal lives as if nothing's happened. When I said at the beginning of this section that it felt like it was 1 foot in the door and 1 foot out, it's because the book didn't know what genre it wanted to be. Superheroes in a political drama can work, and it hadn't really been done with that being the sole focus of the book before, at least not as far as I'm aware, so I have to give it credit for the ambition, but I can't give it any credit for the execution. I'll openly admit that I am a dumb guy reader. I read comics first and foremost to be entertained, and if you don't have a compelling plot, any subtext isn't going to save it. And just so you know, I had to say that before my next sentence, which I imagine I'm going to be crucified for, because I genuinely think Jupiter's Legacy did a better job of exploring the balance between heroism and politics than Ex Machina did. I know that some people are going to think that I'm an absolute idiot because I'm saying that a title by Mark Millar is better than something by Brian K Vaughan, and yes, they are two completely different stories and they both have their own merits, sure, I'll give it that, but if I had to recommend one of these titles, it would be Mark Millar's every single time because it remembered to keep enjoyment at the forefront. And along with not knowing what genre it wanted to be, I feel that Ex Machina didn't know if it wanted to be entertainment or a commentary. What highlights this most is the fact that this is more episodic than I expected it to be. I know I keep going back to it, but it's one of my favourite books and it's by the same creator, but Why the Last Man also was episodic, but always had the same goal in mind. Every arc built into the overall plot and the overall goal of the characters, whereas Ex Machina is kind of just like, hey, here's a drama with a painting, here's a crazy stalker lady, here's some rats. Although yes, I get that it's building into Mitchell's career, which is the main point of the story, they are more side plots, and that's the majority of what we've got here, until the last few issues where it decides to try and have a big climax. I'm not just trying to rip into this book though, because I loved Mitchell's development and the way we are led to question his character. Knowing that Vaughan wanted to explore the concept of heroism and how we place that title onto a person, it makes sense how Mitchell is handled. He isn't supposed to be the mayor who has all the answers. He isn't a trained politician that knows when to rely on his staff, when to stand his ground, or when to yield. He is still headstrong in a way that he had to be as a Great Machine, and it was interesting seeing how the rationale he had as a vigilante often didn't work as mayor. And quick side note, I know I'm British and I'm supposed to say mayor, but we've also got a town that's called York and not Yeah, heck. So I'm just gonna say Maya. Feel free to hate me as much as you want to in the comments over that, but that's what I'm going with for this video. But Mitchell is a flawed character who reminded me in many ways of Nathan Petrelli from Heroes. And if I'm just gonna go on an honest tangent, Nathan was 100 times more interesting than Claire or Peter in their constant "I'm gonna save the world because I'm important" speech that we got for 4 seasons. A character that isn't so black and white, such as Mitchell, is interesting to follow, especially when they have such a high profile position in an important state. And at first, with the episodic plots, I enjoyed this and seeing how Mitchell's decisions played out and how he was progressing as a politician. It's just such a shame and a missed opportunity that they very rarely had more of an impact than on the few issues that arc was featured in. And there was one thing that I found myself enjoying even more than Mitchell's journey, and that was his relationships with the other characters. It's something that I'm going to expand on in the spoilers section, but especially when I'm thinking about Bradbury and Kremlin, and this is where the real strength of the flashbacks came in. Seeing how they interacted whilst Mitchell was the Great Machine and then as Mayor was really fun, and it was never forced, or it never felt like there was too much separation between what happened in the past and what was happening in the present. And his relationship with Angotti was really interesting, and the majority of the tension from this book throughout the whole series came from her and Mitchell. And I just loved that sense that at any moment she was looking for a reason to arrest him, but you also knew that she understood that she has to work with him. Wiley was so lovable as well, and I felt like he was one of the only characters that got a true arc from beginning to end. Gina was a great character too, and I found her to be the more likeable of the two sisters. It's just a shame that the majority of these characters that are just listed are only supporting ones, and that some of the more important figures didn't have as much of an impact on me. And to play devil's advocate, and despite some of my criticisms of the overall structure of the book, its pacing never felt slow. Although I didn't love every part of the story, such as the part with the painting that felt more for the reader rather than in service of the plot, there was never a section that felt like a chore to get through. I just wished that there would have been a better balance between the present day stuff and the flashbacks. Issue 40 was one of my main highlights of the series, and I loved how they went full meta and didn't apologise for it. It wasn't just trying to be tongue-in-cheek, it knew exactly what it was doing. I felt like this was also an example of how good BKV can be when he commits to what he's doing, which was an issue that I had for the rest of the series. Had he just decided to fully go for either a superhero trying to be a politician or a story about a politician trying to hide his past as a superhero, this could have worked better than what we got, which didn't seem to know which it wanted to be. And it's a good job I drank before I started doing this voiceover, because if you haven't disliked this video already, this next sentence will probably help. But Ex Machina got weirdly political, which, yes, I appreciate that sounds dumb that I'm complaining that a superhero political drama got political, but it got to the point where the book felt really dated. I know that politicians are a large part of this book, and I'm not complaining about that. It's something that I definitely expected before I started reading volume 1, but it would often feature real world politicians that for someone like myself who was quite young at the time when this was coming out and not living in New York, it threw me out of the book a bit. It was more just name dropping than actually having them as a part of the series. Again, one foot in the door, one foot out, as it just felt like it didn't know whether it wanted to be its own thing and create a fictional cast of characters or bring in real world people. So in the end it did a weird mix of both, so it doesn't really succeed at either when I was reading it. However, BKV books are never just at surface level. The main theme I took from Ex Machina was about celebrity worship, and if absolute power corrupts absolutely. With what we saw in the first issue, I thought it was really going to hone in on that and slowly build out this plot that really drives home that theme, and show exactly what power can do to someone who doesn't know how to handle it. So in those early issues, I was really excited to see where this one might go, but I can't really say too much more about this particular thought without jumping into the spoilers. This is your final spoiler warning, and if you don't want anything else ruined about this book, I'd recommend jumping to the final verdict timestamp down below. This really could have been something exceptional, but I feel like it didn't know what it wanted to be from the offset. From the first few panels, Mitchell has talked about the Great Fall of 2005, leading us to wonder what could have been so bad, especially as the series goes on and there's the gas attack and the blackout, and it makes you wonder what could top that. But it's almost as if Vaughan was trolling us because of the fact that we were invested in what could have happened, because even Mitchell shrugs it off in the last issue. So that theme I touched on just about absolute power had no weight by the end, unless it's trying to say that power just brings more power with it, because we saw Mitchell start from an engineer, then go on to be a vigilante, then mayor, and then vice president alongside McCain, but he was listed as IGN's 48th greatest hero, so who knows what the fuck I was reading into this book. Honestly though, and this hasn't happened in a while, but this ending made me laugh. I find it quite fitting that midway through Ex Machina, BKV did a few episodes on Lost, because they must have given him a few hints on how to make a laughably bad bad ending. Sorry, Comic Bound. The only parts of the final issue that I really enjoyed was the stuff with Mitchell and Wiley and the final scene with Kremlin. I think, personally, the book should have closed on that scene as a symbol that Mitchell has done everything now to leave the vigilante part of his life behind. He truly is a different person, not someone focused on helping his fellow man. He truly does have this ulterior motive, and I think that that would have been such a powerful moment. As well, it felt like plot points were set up for no real payoff. January being a spy was for nothing. I thought that her and Kremlin were going to be the crushing blow that Mitchell referenced in issue 1, a combination of the sins of his past and those of his current life coming together. But it meant nothing anyway because he voluntarily decided to not run for re-election. And this was a plot point that ran for the majority of this series. You felt like it was building up and it somehow had no weight. Suzanne was another weird plotline. I kind of liked her when she was the love interest and how Mitchell was using her to take some of that heat off himself, where she seemed to have genuine feelings for 100. He had this thing where he felt like he couldn't trust journalists, but he had a journalist that trusted him and she was the one that ended up worse off. I remember midway through the book wondering where she'd gone as she just disappeared, but it felt like she could have added more to the story if she was brought into it more often. But then by the point when I accepted that she'd just left the title, she just reappeared and became the big bad guy of the series. Not Commissioner Angotti, not Fearson, not even Kremlin. It's Suzanne. The reporter that he went on about 2 dates with is suddenly the villain, and mostly because of Bradbury just not really thinking about what he was doing. Just to put this into context, this is Suzanne, a character that doesn't even feature on the list of characters on the Wikipedia page that I needed to check because of the spelling of her last name. The whole mystery of how he got his powers was a bit dull to me anyway. I'm someone who's comfortable with an origin being vague, because that's often the slowest part of a story unless it's something like the Iron Man trilogy. Like if you just need your characters to have powers, I'm the type of guy that will just allow you to not explain where they got them from as long as the rest of the main bulk of your story is still interesting. I know that not everybody's like that and people do like to have things explained to them. It's different strokes for different folks, but for me, I was kind of comfortable with them not really explaining the whole thing about the box. But first we are introduced to this box, and the blackout that followed was something that was given weight initially, but then the story evolved and it wasn't really as integral. But then it's just forced back in at the end so that Suzanne can get powers so that the comic can have a big fight at the conclusion. And besides, it's brought back in and still a bit ambiguous as to how it gives powers. So I'm not sure if I just read this incorrectly, because like I've already acknowledged, I'm a bit dumb, but Bradbury can touch it multiple times and not get powers because it was created for Mitchell on election day, but Suzanne gets hit with it in the face and now she can control minds? Is it just that you need to be cut and that it needs to enter your bloodstream? I don't really know. I don't feel like the explanation was there, or if it was, I don't feel like I picked up on it enough for it to make sense. This is what I was saying when I was talking about making a mistake including real world politicians, because if this was just a fictional world, you know, kind of like Jupiter's Legacy, I'd be cool with all the sci-fi stuff, but it's not. So now all this stuff makes it look like the series proper jumped the shark in the final arc, because it wasn't stuff that I felt like was there from the beginning. You had a few kind of weird sci-fi things, but stuff that could still be explained in a real world setting. Like the time traveler, at first I didn't know if this was somebody that was just a bit crazy, rather than somebody that had actually come back from the future. And talking about weird sci-fi things, the Jammer was a literal Deus Ex Machina. It was introduced in case there was ever a need to stop Mitchell having powers, and the only person foiled by it was Suzanne. I don't know, but it just felt like this MacGuffin was invented just so that there was a way out at the end. Wiley got a good arc though, and I felt like it was well deserved. I really liked that flashback with him as well when he helped out the Great Machine and he was talking to Mitchell about the first time that they met, and I loved that he questioned his position within the administration but proved himself to be better suited for the role of mayor than even Mitchell was. With all the time skipping, it would have been interesting to see how he would have handled being in the position of mayor, to see if history did repeat itself and sort of touch on the fact that everyone can say what they would do, but would they do it once they're given the opportunity? I have to touch on the demonic stuff though, because this is where I really checked out of this book. Again, for my reading, it shot itself in the foot because it set itself in the real world and it tried to be a grounded story. There was enough potential in the initial concept that we didn't need all these hints that he was supposed to be preparing Earth for an invasion and that there's multiple dimensions where there's multiple Mitchells, all of which are trying to take over the world. Yeah, it was just weird. I genuinely felt like I'd missed a few issues at this point. And to me, it felt like BKV just didn't have enough confidence in his original premise to keep this a story that was focused on politics with a hint of the superhero. So instead it just decided to go all horror fantasy. But that's where I felt like the book really lost its way. Out of the other BKV stories that I've read, I don't feel like any of them have jumped the shark as much as this one. Like, could you imagine if you're reading Why the Last Man and then towards the end they're all of a sudden talking about time travel, even though there's been no hint of time travel throughout the rest of the book? That to me is kind of what happened right here in Ex Machina. And there was that kind of weird eco-friendly issue where it was about printing comics on recycled paper, which I thought was a bit odd. Like, it's important to bring that up, but it just threw me out the book because I was like, is BKV just using this comic now to try and get what he wants implemented, rather than care about if the reader is enjoying the story. Oh my god, and his previous arch enemy, Jack Fearson, was possibly the biggest letdown of the entire series. What was the point in any of this? When it was just flashbacks, cool, I was enjoying it. I was wondering if maybe Mitchell might have crossed a line that he'd hidden from his political career and it could have come back to haunt him. Like if he had actually killed Fearson and that was something that the public didn't know, how would they react when they've all figured it out because they all know that he's the Great Machine? But then they kept suggesting that Fearson was still alive, and again, cool. This overlap between his vigilante life and political career is what I thought this story would have been about, and show him that he can't run away from his past. But in the end it all just led to a robot? That was the payoff? Did I miss something here? Because sometimes I can zone out in a book, but what was the point in all those hints? All that build up? Would it have not made more sense for him to be the big bad guy at the end rather than Suzanne? Then it would have made more sense for Mitchell to suit up as the Great Machine once again, show us that that's who he's truly supposed to be, and that maybe Mayor just wasn't his thing. That would have felt more in line with the overall themes and storylines and the flash forward that we got at the beginning of issue 1 that promised this much bigger, deeper story. Bradbury was one of my favourite characters throughout this book, until that final scene. I never picked up on there being any romantic connection between these two, even if they possibly hinted at 100 being gay. Like, did BKV just watch The Bodyguard before he was scripting this last issue and he was like, yeah, that's how this storyline should go. I enjoyed how he took the fall for Mitchell, and I saw this as just him being a good friend and maybe understanding the bigger picture more, because that was the main contrast between him and Kremlin, that Bradbury would follow Mitchell no matter what he was doing, whether that's being the Great Machine or being Mayor, whereas Kremlin was too stuck in the past and trying to get Mitchell back to that point in his life. And I thought that was a great arc and played into how Mitchell was slowly starting to value his own reputation over the lives of others. He was comfortable with Bradbury taking the fall for him as long as it meant that he could exact his plan, because I felt like it was going in a similar progression to what we saw with Walter White in Breaking Bad, but obviously not as extreme. It's why I felt that Journal's death as a result of the gas attack was so pivotal to the overall story and was perhaps the best part of the book. Mitchell was starting to learn that his actions as Mayor had a greater impact than that when he was the Great Machine. The people around him can be hurt and even killed as a result of his decisions, and he also doesn't have the opportunity to save them like he used to when he was a vigilante. And if you noticed how I haven't really mentioned the 9/11 stuff, obviously it's because it's a bit of a touchy subject and I'm not really sure how to approach it without accidentally offending somebody, but with this book I kind of have to talk about it. But the reason why I haven't focused on it so far is because it's the gimmick that I was speaking about earlier. At first when I saw this I was like, okay, ballsy move, but maybe there's an overall purpose to this. It was just there to have the shock impact that this book is willing to directly talk about 9/11, which was ballsy only a few years after the tragedy had happened, but it only occasionally came back to it and had that appallingly handled moment at the end where they spoke about just rebuilding the second tower. But what else did it really do for the story? Beyond the initial shock value and leading you to believe that there was going to be some kind of potential with this series, how did it really change anything? Sure, yes, it factored into Mitchell winning the election and made people question the legitimacy of his candidacy, but it was only for a couple of pages, mostly in flashbacks. And that was about it. If you're going to make a bold move like that, it has to be for a reason other than just doing it just to show that you can. And ironically, that was the argument that the book itself posed in an early arc where the N-word is written on a painting. Are you just doing this because you can, or is there something that you're trying to say? I've tried to confront my thoughts about this before I started this review, and honestly, had the saving of the second tower not been a part of this book, very little of the overall story would have been any different. And when I talk about the missed potential of this book, as much as the dialogue and the characters are written extremely well, and it is a high quality story, I have to look at nothing more than that lone twin tower to know that the story didn't live up to the potential that it set up from the start. This is my final verdict. I wanted to love Ex Machina. I wanted to be able to sit here today and say that it's criminally underrated and that it deserves to be held in that upper echelon of Brian K. Vaughan titles alongside Y the Last Man and Saga. But having read this, I understand now why it isn't included in the conversation when we talk about Brian K. Vaughan's best works. I do think that there's something in here though that would be very appealing to a very specific type of reader. I'm not saying that it's bad, it's just not as great as it could have been. In a way, maybe it's a victim of hype, the hype that I brought into it because of the fact that I've loved Brian K. Vaughan's titles before. But realistically, when a creator is making great story after great story, there is that level of expectation that comes with any future book that you read. And at the time when this was released, Vaughan was at the height of his career. Yes, he hadn't gone across to Image just yet, but he was still writing Y the Last Man, and he was still getting all that critical and fan praise. Maybe the pressure of writing another great independent series got too much for him, I don't really know. But still, considering the fact that it's been 15 years since this title originally released, and I must have dampened my expectations somewhat because of the fact that I hadn't heard it being talked about, it still felt like it was lacking that something that it needed to really be a great book. So to somebody who goes into this series completely blind, maybe you don't know about the cross genres, the more episodic format, and if you don't really put too much weight and stock into what you see in the first issue, then you still may have a really great time with this book. But having read all 50 issues, all 5 of these deluxe editions, it's all contained in one omnibus, I just don't think that there's enough here that I can say that this is a top tier story and that it's something that you must read. There is some good subtext here, especially when we're looking at the political years that have come since this book was originally released, but to me it also came across as a relic of its time because it's got so many references to real world events and real world politicians that aren't really relevant anymore. And to a reader like myself, and you may as well be in that same situation as I was, that you were only about 10 years old when this book first came out, those references are just obscure, so it's only really people who would have been living in New York at that time or who have some kind of really great comprehensive knowledge of the history of the New York political system that would really understand all of those references. Whereas something like Y the Last Man, you can read it now and you still understand what's happening. And maybe it says something about my lack of intelligence, but the only reason why I knew about some of these politicians was because of the fact that they appeared in Borat 2. But the true strength of this book comes from its characters. So if instead of a superhero political drama, you're looking for a character study that looks at a person who is given more power than he knows how to handle, then this might be a book that really interests you. The art is consistently great and unique, and it gives you a sense that you are living within a post 9/11 New York. And at the end of the day, if you enjoy a book, that should be the most important thing for you. So the score for Ex Machina may seem to be unfairly low considering the fact that there's nothing really bad about it, but it's more just the wasted potential that really disappointed me with this title. And I think that is something that I'm correct in feeling because of the fact that it's such a high concept from such a great creative team. So unfortunately, when I look at the series as a whole, I can only give this book a maximum of 50%. Woof! So that's my review, and I know that my opinions might not be something that everybody agrees with, but admittedly, that's why we do reviews, so that we can see what other people think about books. If you've read Ex Machina, I'd love to know what you think down below, so just leave it in the comment section there. If you're planning on picking up any books and you want to support your boy, please use the affiliate link for organic price books in the description down below. And if you use code WOOFWOOF, you will get $2 off your order. Please share this video where you can so that we can see if we can get more of a discussion about this book. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you didn't, why did you get this far? Subscribe if you're new here and click the bell notification so that you never miss a video. Why not check out one of my other videos or catch up on my previous reviews, but until next time, just make sure that you stay safe, stay reading the best books that you can find, and stay mad all you dogs. Woof woof! See you in the next video.